how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? How many stars are in the heavens? How long is forever? I can't answer the first two, but I know the answer to the third. For years, 3 weeks, 5 days, 2 hours, 10 minutes, and 50 seconds, give or take a tick. Foolish me, I thought till death do us part would last a lot longer. But I'll be damned if at 3:14 on Friday, June 15th, the sheriff's deputy didn't walk up to my desk and hand me an envelope. "You've been served," was all he said before he made a crisp turn and walked out of the bank. Every eye was upon me as I opened the manila envelope and read the words "petition for dissolution of marriage." I felt a tightness in my chest as though I was having a heart attack. I wasn't that lucky. It got even better. There was also a restraining order prohibiting me from going home to the house which I owned before I got married. It said I couldn't even call Bree and to find out why she wanted a divorce. My wife of 4 years swore under oath that she feared for her safety if I were to contact her. I guess she forgot to tell the judge we had made love the previous night, twice. Change that. I made love to her. She screwed me. I had to go to my mother's house with only the clothes on my back and ask for my old room back. To say I never saw it coming would be the greatest understatement ever uttered. I was a blissful idiot making plans for our future, dreaming dreams of babies yet to be born and looking forward to growing old with my best friend. Everything I knew was torn asunder. The next month was a whirlwind of hell. My finances were examined with a fine-tooth comb, lest I be hiding $1 to buy a value meal for lunch. Depositions followed. As Dante Alighieri wrote in the Divine Comedy, each level of hell was worse than the last. I got to see them all. Through it all, I kept asking only one question. Why? You don't do your best thinking when your spirit is broken, so I agreed to everything. All I asked from my soon-to-be ex is that she answer my one question. When our court date came, she didn't even have the class to do that to my face. Instead, her slick lawyer handed me a single sheet of paper, not even handwritten but typed, double-spaced with wide margins. What a relief! I hadn't done anything wrong. She just reconnected on Facebook with Charles Winston Roman III, her first love from college, her soul mate. The very one who had taken the virginity which I have been assured had been my wedding present. It seems they were a modern-day Romeo and Juliet. C.W. as Roman II forbade his only son to marry Brienne. 4 years later, fate intervened and he died of a massive heart attack. The day after the old man's funeral, the son went searching for his former lover. The next paragraph damn near knocked me on my ass. "I'm divorcing you because I respect you too much to have an affair with Charles. Boy, am I lucky she held me in such high esteem, or she might have stripped me of my soul and kicked my corpse to the curb." Oh wait, she did? I was crying too hard to read the rest. Our no-fault divorce was finalized 2 days later. I left the courthouse, drove to the bank, and tendered my resignation. I was no longer able to think rationally, so I decided to quit before I got fired, and now I drive to nowhere, in particular California. Why California? I always wanted to see the Pacific Ocean. My next stop was the Ford dealer where I traded in my Mustang convertible for a late model 3/4-ton pickup truck with a slide and camper. A moving van had showed up at Mom's house while I was gone and dropped off 6 cardboard boxes which contained all of my possessions. It took me a couple of days to get the camper ready for cross-country travel. It would be my home for at least the next year. Mom tried to talk me out of leaving, but my mind was made up. I told her I needed to do this if I was going to survive. I promised to call on a regular basis. I decided to stay away from the interstate and drive west on back roads until I was low on gas and see what fate had in store for me. My plan was to find a menial job, something which required more back than brain, and stick around for no more than 2 weeks in any one place. I pulled into a small town just as the sun was setting. The only thing open on Main Street was a down-on-its-heels bar which served food. I noticed a handwritten sign in the window, "Help Wanted." Over a cold beer, I talked to the bartender/owner about the job. I told him I was just passing through, but was looking to make a few bucks for gas. He had me nervously before he said, "A hard day's work for minimum wage. You get your lunch and dinner and any tips that come your way. You pay for your own beer." I replied, "If you've got a place, I can park my camper on your man, right out back on the gravel. Then put this apron on and get started by bussing tables." And so I began my new career. On day 7 of my odyssey, I met a woman maybe 10 years older than me, but not at all bad looking. That night I had sex with only the second woman in my life. It felt good, very good. True to my word, I left after 2 weeks. Phil, the owner, handed me a pay envelope and said, "You got a job anytime you want one." Over the next 6 months, I worked at 12 different restaurants/diners/dive bars and met a dozen different women who heard my story and wanted to cheer me up. Then I ran into an unexpected obstacle: winter in the Rocky Mountains. The snow was blowing so thick I could barely see the road as I pulled into a nameless Colorado town. From the lack of traffic, it looked like everyone with a lick of common sense was tucked snugly in bed to ride out the storm. The only lights I saw were the police station. I parked out front and explained to the deputy I needed a place to park until the roads were clear. He was a nice guy and said I could park in their lot. He even made a call to the restaurant across the road so I could get something to eat. The owner was an older woman who spoke with an Italian accent. She eyed me up and down. "My grandson says you're looking to ride out the storm in a tin can on a pick-em-up. You look like a nice boy. I got a cot in the stockroom that will be a lot more comfortable." I thanked her as I wolfed down some of the best cooking I had ever eaten. The next morning, I was woken before the sun rose by the sounds of Mrs. Villano cooking. I looked out the window. All I could see was snow. As I got dressed, I noticed a stack of several dozen cans of paint stacked against the wall. After we exchanged good mornings, I asked about the paint. My late husband, God rest his soul, bought them about 10 years ago. Silly fool never painted anything in his life. I worked my way through college painting houses and would be glad to swap my labor for your cooking. A deal was struck, one that changed the course of my life. I would paint the entire restaurant to work off room and board. I would also be helping in the kitchen to prepare for the dinner rush. Each afternoon, I quit painting, washed up, and donned an apron to learn the secrets of authentic Italian cooking. I spent the next 5 mornings on a ladder, washing the stamped tin ceiling, then painting a base color. An accent color made the ceiling look worthy of a Sistine Chapel. My Peter. "That looks so beautiful. You are an artist." The next day, the roads were opened and customers began to wander in. To a wonder, he snapped back, and they admired my effort. Quite a few young ladies also stopped by to admire the painter, and I soon had a full social calendar. I didn't get much painting done over the next few days as Mrs. Villano's waitress never showed up. I assured her I was an experienced waiter and took over the front of the house while she ruled the kitchen. We made a very good team. I slept like a rock that night. It was the first time I hadn't read Breen's letter before I went to bed. Notice I didn't say I went to sleep, a commodity which had been eluding me. The next morning, I was woken up by an honest-to-goodness rooster crowing. Later, I learned Mrs. Villano woke the rooster up. In the lull between lunch and dinner, I stood at her elbow and learned her secrets. Mrs. Villano loved to sing, mostly Italian love songs. Soon she had me harmonizing with her. She also decided to teach me to speak Italian while she cooked. I was a quick study, and soon we were conversing in her mother tongue. Well, maybe conversing was a bit of a stretch, but I was absorbing everything she said. She was the most patient woman I ever met. The lessons kept coming. In the spring, we planted an herb garden. In the fall, I learned how to make wine and produce. I broke my rule and stayed on for 18 months, learning how to cook like the master and speak like her too. I finished painting on a warm spring day and told Mrs. Villano it was time for me to move on. She smiled and said she understood. I was given a going-away party worthy of a victorious general. Mrs. Villano gave me several presents, including a hand-copied recipe book and a case of homemade wine. After she gave me one last hug, she handed me an envelope with a name and address on it. "When you get to San Francisco, see my cousin Anthony. Tell him you're the son I always wanted." I decided to do some sightseeing and took the long tourist route to the coast. I even won a few bucks in Reno, the biggest little city in the world, and sped into the Grand Canyon. For weeks later, I was having lunch at Fisherman's Wharf. The next morning, I showed up at the address on the envelope. It was a very nice-looking Italian restaurant nestled in the center of 24 other very nice-looking Italian restaurants. It seems Nob Hill was the motherlode for lovers of Italian food. The neighborhood smelled like heaven. The restaurant was dark, so I knocked on the door. A short, bald man, all dressed in white, peeked out of the kitchen and shouted, "We're not open." I knocked again. This time he opened the door. "What do you want?" I handed him the envelope. "It's about time you got here. Then he shouted in Italian, "Hey boss, that guy that knows everything is here." Tony looked at the note, then roared with laughter. Evidently, they didn't know I could understand Italian as he read the letter out loud. "That crazy cousin of mine says I should turn my kitchen over to this stranger and let him cook." His staff howled and made some very unflattering comments about how a man who looks like white bread thinks he can cook like one of us. I decided not to let on. Tony noticed the large cardboard box and 2 overstuffed shopping bags on the ground next to me. "What's he got in there, chef? Are you moving in?" The employees taunted me in Italian. "A present from Mrs. Villano." I opened the box and showed him 4 bottles of homemade wine. Tony called for a glass and uncorked one of the gallon bottles. He poured enough for a taste, then refilled the glass and took a swallow. "Who made this?" The bottle was passed around and everyone got to sample the wine. "Mrs. Villano taught me how last fall. If you can cook as good as you make wine, I might keep you around." Tony called for his daughters, and I was introduced to Gina and Anne-Marie, the 2 most perfect, stunningly beautiful raven-haired twins I could ever imagine. I stammered a plea to meet you. Anne-Marie smiled and said, "Nice to meet you too." Gina instead gave me the evil eye and said, "So this is the legendary cook from Colorado." I heard someone behind me laugh, then declare the legend. Him a legend. This was followed by a wall of laughter, thus I was anointed with my nickname. Tony announced in Italian, "Fine, let's see what the legend can cook. I may be crazy, but I trust my cousin. Tonight San Francisco will be his judge." Gina was staring daggers at me. You understood every word she said. My smile had betrayed me. She began to berate me in Italian until I defended myself in her mother tongue. The kitchen staff watched in amazement as we went toe-to-toe. Tony finally separated us, saying, "Save it for later. Your boyfriend has work to do." "Boyfriend?" She spit at my feet. "Tomorrow he'll be lucky to be the dishwasher." Then she uttered a few choice epitaphs and stormed off. Tony laughed and said, "I think she likes you. Now get to work. You're doing the soup and 2 specials for tonight." I picked up my bags, which were chock full of herbs and spices, said a quick prayer, and greeted my staff. For the rest of the night we spoke Italian. That night my supino, a traditional Italian fisherman's soup made with fresh Dungeness crab, bay scallops, shrimp, and clams, sold out in an hour. We ran out of my linguine a limos made with Dungeness crab caught within sight of the city a few minutes later. My evening was complete when a waiter told me 2 people almost came to blows over the last order of my made-from-scratch basil pesto nakai. Tony walked into the kitchen and threw his arms around me, and Marie proclaimed, "Tonight a legend was born." Gina, however, stayed in her office doing the books. She never said a word, even though I had one of the waiters bring her samples of both. I thanked everyone in the kitchen and knew I had found a new home. The only change I would have to make was to play music and encourage my team to sing while they worked. As Mrs. Villano always said, music makes the food taste better. The Winston fortune was made in real estate. The grandfather, Charles Winston I, specialized in foreclosures. He bought, many would say stole, dozens of farms during the Great Depression. After World War II, he began subdividing cornfields and building cookie-cutter houses, which the government would finance for returning GIS. He had 1 set of blueprints in each house. Other than the color of the shingles and shutters, was a clone of every other. The old man, Charles Winston Roman II-, don't call me Junior, followed in the family tradition and bought options on a number of farms ringing the city when times were bad during the OPEC recession in the early 1970s. He quietly sat on them until the late 1980s when the real estate market became white hot. Construction trailers were followed by model homes and the money came pouring in. C.W. Roman III and Breen wasted no time in getting hitched. Their honeymoon on a tropical paradise didn't go quite as the brochure promised when both were felled by an intestinal parasite. The resort disclaimed all responsibility, saying they hadn't heeded their warnings not to eat food from the vendors who plied the beach. On their return, the cocksure kid called a meeting and announced he was changing the direction of the company. My father had his day, but the time for being conservative is long gone. Effective immediately, we are getting more aggressive. I want you out there shaking the bushes to find farmers who are looking to cash out. Unfortunately, CW3 lacked his old man's business acumen and vision. He was a narcissistic egomaniac who thought he knew more than everyone else, and now nobody could stop him. He began buying farmland outright at historic high prices. When the real estate bubble burst in 27, he had leveraged everything he owned. The Great Recession strangled the economy. People stopped buying new houses. Where everyone else saw trouble and pulled back, CW imagined opportunity and borrowed even more money to buy out his biggest competitor. He now owned over 500 vacant acres as well as more than 50 houses under construction. The only thing he didn't have were customers. He tried every trick he could think of to move inventory with nary a nibble. Soon the mail was thick with mechanics' liens from unpaid contractors. Nervous bankers saw the value of their collateral plunge and called his notes demanding payment in full. The third was confident he could weather the storm and liquidated everything, including the modest stock portfolio he inherited. He even cashed in his insurance policies. His last gasp was to raid his safety deposit box of every piece of his mother's jewelry. But it wasn't enough to buy him even a month's reprieve from his creditors. The day his house was going to be seized by creditors, he poured himself a glass of scotch, took his father's finest 12-gauge shotgun out of the gun cabinet, and blew his brains out. His casket would not open at the wake. Brian found him minutes before a sheriff's deputy arrived to serve eviction papers. It was, she thought, the worst day of her life. Unfortunately, many more were ahead as her late husband's fiscal malfeasance came to light. "You promised Dad you would walk me down the aisle." My sister Denise's wedding date was drawing close, and she was demanding I honor my word. I wanted to go to her wedding, but there was one problem. My ex Brienne was the groom's cousin and would be there with her mother. I hadn't seen her in over 5 years and would prefer to keep it that way for the rest of my life. My sister, however, was relentless and finally wore down my resolve. And so plans were made for me to take a weekend off to fly to Chicago. I had been working out at a health club and had to admit I looked pretty damn good in a tuxedo. The limousine driver timed it perfectly. The groomsmen and bridesmaids were milling around outside of the church, no doubt wondering if the wanderlust brother would actually make an appearance after 5 years. I could hear the organ playing as I got out. I was followed out by my dates, Gina and Anne Marie. The two incredibly beautiful twin sisters were wearing designer dresses that fit them perfectly. Each had a thigh-high slit which showed off their lace-top stockings. A month earlier, when I told them I couldn't go because I didn't have a date, both offered to accompany me and play the role. I teased that I loved both of them equally and couldn't make that decision. Gina, the older twin by almost 5 minutes, suggested I change my response card from +1 to +2, and Marie seconded the idea and said I was outvoted. My sister asked who was the third person on my response card. I told her she would have to get married to find out. The bridal party looked on in stunned awe as I took one beautiful woman on each arm and escorted them up the aisle to the bride's family pew. The look on Mom's face was priceless. Damn, they looked hot. More than a few people must have gotten whiplash as their heads wrenched around to see the long-absent brother strutting towards the altar. Cameras were flashing from nearly every pew. A group of high school friends applauded and whistled as we walked past. I spotted Brienne sitting with her mother. Time had not been her friend, and she had packed on at least 30 pounds. She had a confused look on her pasty face. Both of my dates kissed me before I returned to my escort duties. I met Wendy in the narthex and told her how beautiful she looked. She giggled and said, "You a hole?" Nobody could top that entrance. We began our procession as the organ played the wedding march. Denny had one other request that I give the before-dinner toast. I have never been comfortable with public speaking but agreed to say a few words. I tried to scribble some thoughts down but wasn't having a lot of success when I noticed an elderly couple sitting alone at the groom's table. I found out they were the groom's grandparents who had flown from Italy just for the occasion. I also learned they didn't speak a word of English. I was nervous and tried to ignore them, but they looked so perfect sitting together, smiling in a room full of strangers, speaking a language which they didn't understand that they inspired me. 100 scenarios ran through my mind. Most involved shining a spotlight on Brienne and asking her to explain what she meant when she swore "till death do us part." Instead, I took the high ground and, in flawless Italian, asked the elderly couple to please stand. I greeted them with hugs and asked the crowd to toast the patriarch and matriarch of a great family now united with mine. After a lengthy round of applause, I announced, "Brad, Wendy, please join me up here." The room drew quiet, wondering what I was up to. I asked each to hold their right hand out. On our father's deathbed, he had my sister place her hands in mine, then wrapped his around ours. With the little strength he had left, he squeezed and said, "I'm sorry I won't be there to share the rest of your life. So I am passing my responsibility on to your brother. Peter, you will be Wendy's best friend. You will be her teacher and her protector. Don't fail me. Tonight, I pass this sacred trust on to your husband. John, I bind your soul to Wendy's. You are now one. You are her best friend, her teacher, and her protector. Don't fail me." The crowd roared its approval, all except Brienne, who was sobbing uncontrollably. Her mother tried in vain to console her. After dinner, a quartet began playing a medley of mediocre songs. The music wasn't bad, but the group lacked a strong vocal lead. Gina and Anne-Marie grabbed me by my arms and led me across the dance floor where they liberated the microphone. Gina dismissed the guitar players and drummer outright and challenged the keyboard man to keep up with us. Then she announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, direct from a 3-year engagement in San Francisco. I give you the legend." The banquet hall went wild. We had plenty of experience singing together at the restaurant and spent the next 2 hours serenading my sister and her new husband with love songs. Gina and Marie harmonized like angels. We even got the groom's grandfather up to lead the tarantella, while the groom graced the dance floor with his grandmother. Denny stood there with her mother beaming with happiness. When we finally took a break, my former mother-in-law approached me. "Peter, could I please have a moment?" "Good evening, Mrs. Bennington. Brian was hoping to get a chance to talk to you, but it seems you are as elusive as the wind. She would like to apologize and ask you to forgive her." "Mrs. Bennington, that's not necessary. It's been many years since anything Mrs. Winston said mattered to me. Please, Peter, don't be like that. Please talk to her." "I will never do that, but there is something I would like to give you." I reached into my wallet and took out a ragged piece of paper. "The day your daughter divorced me, her lawyer handed me this. I must have read it 10,000 times. My tears might make it a little hard to read, but my tears are dried and I no longer feel the pain of her betrayal. This is the last link to your daughter. Take it. It's now yours. If you'll excuse me, my dates are waiting." I turned and never looked back.